we have plans to invade the Middle East?
Are you crazy?
Am I?
Look, Turner.
Do we have plans?
No, absolutely not. We have games. That's all. We play games. What if? How many men? What would it take? Is there a cheaper way to destabilize a regime? That's what we're paid to do.
Walk on. Go on. So Atwood just took the games too seriously. He was really going to do it, wasn't he?
It's a renegade operation. Atwood knew 5412 would never authorize it. There was no way, not with the heat on the company.
Well, what if there hadn't been any heat? Supposing I hadn't stumbled on a plan. Say nobody had.
Different ball game. Fact is, there was nothing wrong with the plan. Well, the plan was all right. The plan would have worked.
Boy, what is it with you people? You think not getting caught in a lie is the same thing as telling the truth?
No. It's simple economics. Today it's oil, right? In 10 or 15 years, food, plutonium, and maybe even sooner. Now, what do you think the people are going to want us to do then?
Ask them.
Not now. Then. Ask them when they're running out. Ask them when there's no heat in their homes and they're cold. Ask them when their engines stop. Ask them when people who've never known hunger start going hungry. You want to know something? They won't want us to ask them. They'll just want us to get it for them.
Boy, have you found a home?
The voices of Robert Redford and Cliff Robertson from a film 33 years old approximately, and probably plays more and is more timely, actually plays better in 2008 than perhaps in 1975. We're talking about 3 Days of the Condor, about midway through the great career of Sydney Pollack. Our spotlight on tonight's edition of Take Two, the movie program on public radio KCBX. And to have this invigorating conversation with me is my good friend, Bob Whiteford.
And across the aisle from me, the one, the only, the czar of film on the Central Coast, known and loved and admired internationally, a man I'm proud to call my friend, and yours, Jim Dee.
Bob, here we are. Again, the melancholy of losing Sydney Pollack so early. Again, this is part two of our tribute to the great Sydney Pollack, but just also, as I mentioned, invigorating to discuss the career of this amazing writer, director, actor, producer, and a number of other credits I'm probably leaving out.
And I think once we're done, Jimmy, I'm sure folks out there will go, well, you know, you forgot this film, you forgot that film. It's inevitable, folks. I mean, if we were to talk about every movie Sydney Pollack did, we'd probably be here. It'd be Sydney Pollack month and a half. But, you know, I think, Jim, an interesting thread in this segment is, like you mentioned in your introduction, there's a few films here that Pollack's done that are definitely way more relevant in today's world than they were when they came out. And I think as an artist, a filmmaker, that's a great talent to have, because he's given us something that is relevant now. And that clip we heard was 33 years ago, folks. Pretty scary how it sounds relevant to what's happening right now. That's the mark of a genius, an artist. I mean, man, every time I hear that clip, Jimmy, it just sends chills down my spine.
Well, you know, I do want to get back to 3 Days of the Condor just to get everyone up to speed. You know, you can log on to our website, kcbx.org, and go to podcast. You can listen to part one of our tribute to Sydney Pollack that we aired last week. But just to give you the overview, Sydney Pollack was born in 1934 in Indiana. He passed away May of 2008, diagnosed with cancer, and a career not only spanning about 21 films, feature films to his credit, but also a producer of many films. And early work in television, not only directing but acting. His first film out of the TV gate, so to speak, back in 1965 with Anne Bancroft, The Slender Thread. About then, too, he got struck up a relationship with Quincy Jones, and they were really good friends throughout their life. And Quincy Jones came out with a statement after Pollack's death, just talking about what an incredible guy he was. Our first show touched upon films such as This Property is Condemned, The Swimmer, Castle Keep, They Shoot Horses, Don't They, Jeremiah Johnson, The Way We Were, The Yakuza, and now we are up to 1975 with our opening clip from 3 Days of the Condor. And again, Bob, you say how prophetic this film was. And, it is amazing when they're talking about running out of oil or running out of food and invading the Middle East. In fact, not to give away too much of this film because it's a treat to watch, but I mean, it's the collusion of, independent energy company with the government planning on invading the Middle East for oil. What a concept, eh?
Do you think that really happened?
There's another thing I want to make note about 3 Days of the Condor, and that is, Bob, we've seen hitmen galore on the big screen. Hitmen have kind of an aura when they're played, Joe Pesci in Goodfellas, and perhaps more recently the incredible Javier Bardem in No Country for Old Men. However, I would have to say that one of my favorite on-screen hitmen is in 3 Days of the Condor. We're talking about the very exquisite, he's a gentleman, Max von Sydow, who played Jesus in The Greatest Story Ever Told, is one of the most eloquent hitmen I've ever seen on the screen. He explains why he's a hitman. There's a scene in the film where Robert Redford thinks he's going to get bumped off by him. He's not the target, and the two of them end up having an amazing conversation about events in the film, for instance. But to have a hitman in a suit who looks like he's just dressed to the nines and he's very articulate, but his job is to, do away with people. It's one of the most amazing hitmen I think I've ever seen on the screen, Max von Sydow in Sydney Pollack's 3 Days of the Condor.
It's true, Jimmy. I mean, he has a real urbanity towards him, about him. And yet, I mean, he kills ruthlessly, but he also has his own code of ethics. He kills who he's supposed to kill. He doesn't deviate. And that's what I think part of the problem is in this movie, is that, or for his character in this movie, I should say, let me rephrase that, is that Redford was supposed to be hit, and because he just stepped out to get a sandwich or something, he was saved. So that's what set this whole thing in motion. This is a fascinating, complex, interesting, character-driven film. And folks, if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend you go back and visit it. And if you have seen it, revisit 3 Days of the Condor.
And one thing to repeat this week, Bob, I think is important about Sydney Pollack is, again, he was open to being interviewed in script and being filmed. He loved to talk about movies. He talked about movies in general, talked about his own work. And I watched a brief interview of Sydney Pollack talking about 3 Days of the Condor, and originally it was almost like a James Bond type thriller, the way it was treated. And then here again, the Pollack touch is sort of like very human, well-defined characters, and they're somewhat overwhelmed by these forces that are far more powerful than they are. And in this case, it's the CIA and a shadow government within the U.S. government and so on. But it's interesting how he molded this piece into a prophetic and timeless film about, fascism, in that here's a company getting together with the government to go invade a country. And I find it very interesting that it went from sort of a James Bond adventure thriller, espionage type thriller, to what it is, which is more of an indictment of our government and trying to get their hands on as much of that oil as they can.
You know what's interesting about this film, Jimmy? It just dawned on me. It's based on a novel by Richard Condon, who also wrote the Manchurian Candidate. So, I mean, yes, I mean, if you're into these films about inside jobs in regards to the government, and yeah, you can say, well, it's paranoid, but it's paranoia with a little meat behind it. There's an element of truth to it, and that's what makes it far more terrifying than some pyrotechnic-driven exercise. That's why 3 Days of the Condor stands up so well.
And as we go forward into Sydney Pollack's directing career, we're going to we shouldn't say gloss over, I shouldn't say that, but again, his working with the top actors in the business. Right after 3 Days of the Condor, he worked with Al Pacino and Bobby Deerfield in 1977. After that, a reteaming with Robert Redford and Jane Fonda, who was in They Shoot Horses, Don't They, in 79 with The Electric Horseman. And two films that did quite well at the box office. I think Bobby Deerfield wasn't too big of a hit, but again, I think the focus here is the fact that Pollack seemed to always draw to him the best in the business.
He was strictly A-list all the way.
He was. Let's move on now. The next film after The Electric Horseman in 1979, what I consider to be a fascinating film, from 1981, Absence of Malice, and Paul Newman, Sally Field, and a big cast. Hal Holbrook is in this film. Gene Hackman, not Gene Hackman, that's later. Bob
Balaban.
Balaban, and I'm thinking of somebody else. But anyway, the main characters here, I'm sorry I got off there. I started thinking about The Firm, which comes later. In Absence of Malice, what is fascinating about this film, Bob, is it's just about a story appearing in a newspaper about Paul Newman, questioning his, actions, and it snowballs into this horrible situation for the Paul Newman character. And as we were talking before the show, I had mistaken the fact that All the President's Men was a Sidney Pollack film. It's not. It's directed by Alan Pakula. I was confused because there's Robert Redford, there's Dustin Hoffman, of course, and it's a film that probably could have been directed by Sidney Pollack. However, Absence of Malice, which is directed by Sidney Pollack, talks about, as you said, Bob, the flip side of journalism. Here we have in All the President's Men, the guy's digging, looking for the truth, and then giving the truth to the American public. In Absence of Malice, it's the irresponsibility of journalism and the misuse of, say, sources that turns this into just an amazing film, but it's very nuanced. I mean, it's, the anger that Paul Newman has as being fingered in this story that just comes out of nowhere and has the ability of ruining his life is absolutely amazing.
You know what's interesting about this film, Jimmy, is I think this is a movie that also was way ahead of its time. I think it came out around 1981. And the idea... Now, folks, think about this plot premise and then think about recent history in this country. Powerful person gives story to reporter. Reporter doesn't check the facts on the story. They go ahead and print the story as it's laid out to them by said powerful person. So what happens is that when people, especially in this case, the person who the story is directed towards says, "Why did you do this? Where did you get this? This is a lie." Reporters' only ethical stand is to protect her sources. Sounds very much like the lead up to the Iraq War, how members of the administration used reporters or their relationship with reporters to get out their story pretty much without the facts being checked, and the reporters, once they're cornered in the fact that the stories they're writing are erroneous, step back and say, "I'm going to protect my sources." I'm thinking of Judith Miller of the New York Times. And in this case, the bad guy who's dropping the slam piece is Bob Balaban at his absolutely emotionally coreless, black-hearted best. And you've got Sally Field as kind of the reporter who's friendly and nice and a good person, but not really reading between the lines. She's somewhat of a sympathetic character. We like her, but she made a mistake. And Paul Newman is wonderful as the victim because he wants to hate her, but he doesn't hate her. But he's in a jam because of what she's done. And he's trying desperately to find out who it is that's after him, and she won't tell him. And this film, in the hands of maybe other filmmakers, less talented filmmakers, wouldn't work nearly as well as it does here under the watchful and wonderful hand of Sydney Pollack. I might add, Jim, that this is another film like Sidney Lumet's Prince of the City, which came out around the same time, where it seemed to suffer at the box office because its storyline was a little too, I don't want to use the word intelligent, but it just seemed
That's
like
okay.
It just seemed like it required something of the viewers to sit down and think a little bit as the film's unfolding. And unfortunately, this film didn't do all that well at the box office, though Paul Newman and Sally Field are wonderful in this. This film has aged very well.
I believe Paul Newman got an Oscar nomination. He didn't get it, of course. It was until later. But, Bob, what's really I'm following what you're saying, and the thing about this film in the hands of another director, another writer, let's just say, is the finger pointing at Paul Newman's character. I mean, he's under investigation because of some shady dealings or something, but they don't really play it up. It's just the fact that his name was besmirched in the paper. Whereas in another film, I could see how they could point a big sexual scandal or blow up whatever the finger pointing is about, as opposed to you don't really find out what Paul Newman, the problem is, it's just the fact that there was erroneous. I mean, the way it's done in this film, the story about Paul Newman is sort of true. There's sort of things that are true about him, but there's also major falsehoods. But they don't really come out and explain them. It's just the fact that here you are on the front page and your name is being, dragged through the mud. They don't play up the specifics. It's the getting to the core of why it happened and how, like, Sally Field can be in a position of saying, well, this is my job and this is protecting my sources and so on and so forth, as you said. So, this is not a film based on, sensationalism.
It's not Peyton Place.
No. I mean, it's a sensational topic, but it's treated in a very human and intelligent and understated way. And it's a fabulous film. Revisiting this week, it was just great to see Absence of Malice once again. Let's listen to a clip. Here is Paul Newman, who is out on a boat. He doesn't want to be overheard. He's entertaining Sally Field, the reporter, and they're discussing this story that was in her newspaper about Paul Newman. This is from Absence of Malice.
Gallagher, I'm a reporter. What'd you expect? Don't try to make me feel guilty.
Do you really think I had something to do with Diaz, huh?
It's a distinct possibility. If there's nothing there, then why are they picking on you?
I gotta know where that story came from. Knowledgeable sources, you said. Now, who is that? Somebody's trying to get to me. Somebody with no face and no name. You're the gopher. You listen to them, you write what they say, and then you help them hide. You say you got a right to do that. And I got no right to know who they are.
I'm sorry, Gallagher. I can't help you.
Paul Newman and Sally Field from Sidney Pollack's Absence of Malice. And, what's great about, again, we talk about the characters in Sidney Pollack's films, Bob, and they're smart. I mean, in this one, Paul Newman knows exactly what's going on. He just needs to know the fine details of who set the thing in motion. But, I mean, here he is talking to Sally Field saying, hey, you were set up, essentially, to get this thing in the paper, and now you're protecting your source. And, it's just a great little film, and lots of great stars in this film, of course, under the direction of Sidney Pollack.
This one's first rate. And folks, it was probably ignored unjustly during its theatrical run. Highly recommend you go back and revisit Absence of Malice.
Okay, well, the next film that Sidney Pollack directed, perhaps his biggest whenever his name is brought up, especially in light of his untimely death, from 1982, perhaps his biggest hit, and his the one he's known for, that's Tootsie. And we had a clip from that last week, but, Bob, when I first saw Tootsie, I didn't buy the Dustin Hoffman character as a woman, but as I saw the film later, I felt better about the character, and the entire film is very well done. And, we were talking about the political element in a lot of Pollack's films, and I guess in this film you can talk about gender politics. And big hit. Bill Murray does a great turn in this film, too, a smaller role, but boy, he's very good in it. And to pull this off, the clip we played last week, Sidney Pollack plays Michael Dorsey's agent, who is real savvy and has the best in for Dustin Hoffman. Of course, he tells him the truth and the fact that he's very hard to deal with. And I think one of the quintessential scenes in this film, of course, is when Dustin Hoffman dresses up as Dorothy Michaels, I guess her name is, and I remember, and confronts him in a restaurant in New York. And it's a scene that I've seen the scene many, many times, but there he is all decked out, and his voice lowers to Sidney Pollack and says, "It's me, Michael Dorsey." How are you? Like that, and it's so funny and it's so well played, and both of them are great. But I think Sidney Pollack as the agent who can't believe his eyes just plays it very, very well, and of course always tells Dustin Hoffman to get therapy.
Well, what's great about this film, Jimmy? I think this film is always fun to watch, but I think in terms of Sidney Pollack, this is where he kind of sets his template as a character actor. He's kind of smart, kind of hot-headed, and he doesn't pull any punches when he talks to people, and he's not a dumb guy, and he doesn't like to be made a fool of or for people to think he's dumb. And this is a character or a characterization to some extent he would go back and revisit as an actor in Woody Allen's Husbands and Wives, Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, Michael Clayton, which I think was his last film as an actor. And so that's kind of interesting because as we mentioned last week, Jimmy, it's like he started out as an actor too. And we saw him in his first movie, and we were kind of scratching our heads going, that's him? But this is where, he's really kind of turned into the Sidney Pollack screen presence that we've come to know and love in all these great films that he would do much later in his career.
Yes. Well, Tootsie, a big hit for Sidney Pollack and the entire cast in 1982, putting him on the map. And, right out of the gate, it took 3 years later for him to complete his next film, but it was a big one. Out of Africa in 1985. And again, here is Mr. Redford and, of course, the amazing Meryl Streep with one of her accents. And in remembering the film, Bob, before going on the air, the great Klaus Maria Brandauer starring in this. And that's a name that may not be too familiar to American audiences, but boy, I would say that he was the top German or Hungarian. I think he's German.
I
think. But he had just won acclaim in the film called Mephisto. It won an Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film. And here he is working with Sidney Pollack. And, I got to say that right up there with Meryl Streep and Robert Redford, I guess it was amazing to get Klaus Maria Brandauer in the cast, a dynamic performance in Out of Africa.
Whatever happened to him, Jimmy? I mean,
wonder.
around the mid-'80s, he was doing everything. I mean, he was in Never Say Never Again, the Sean Connery return to Bond, playing the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
Colonel Radel, I think, was
Yes.
another great film that he did. It's a shame because you're right. Out of Africa wouldn't nearly be as good without him as the charmingly rakish, unfaithful husband of Meryl Streep's character, Karen Blixen. And, I mean, it just wouldn't be the same without him.
No. He's just a pistol on screen. Usually he's just very dynamic and just he's an amazing actor. Out of Africa, 1985, also a big hit for Sydney Pollack. We were talking about relationships also in Sydney Pollack's films, where the relationship or the relationship that will last forever after doesn't really seem to happen all that much. However, what Pollack does do, and I just sort of formulated this over doing the research for the show, was he does have male-female relationships that may be even more interesting than a romantic relationship. The romantic undercurrent is usually there, but whether it plays out or not is almost not important in a lot of cases. Well, we mentioned 3 Days of the Condor and Robert Redford and Faye Dunaway, and totally integral to the part, but or to the plot of the movie, I should say, but not a relationship that, at the end they're riding off in the sunset. And the same thing happens here in Out of Africa, where there is a simmering undercurrent of romanticism and sexuality with Meryl Streep and Robert Redford, but it doesn't quite play out, but he does still explore that a different kind of relationship, which I really admire that he does.
And when you think about it, Jimmy, their relationship is very romantic, very subtle, juxtaposed against the scale of this film. Africa, the continent. I mean, it's huge, it's expansive, and yet there are these two people that are attracted to each other, but they can't quite get together. There's either she's married, he's kind of a loner. He comes and he goes. There's a war. There's all kinds of obstacles that seem to get in the way. But that being said, for all the obstacles, it's like when they meet each other, in the rare times they bump into each other, there's something there, something very profound, and they know it. Pollack knows it, and he wants you, the film goer, to know it. And I think it's a great part of what makes this film work. And frankly, I think this was, like you said, it was definitely a box office smash, critically acclaimed. I think it won a few Academy Awards. It was a big, big film, and it stands up really well.
It does. Here's a scene from Out of Africa with Meryl Streep and Robert Redford. This is a scene earlier in the film. Robert Redford had given Meryl Streep a compass because she was involved in this rather treacherous journey across an expanse of desert in Africa. This is the first time they meet up afterwards. What you want to hear here is the fact that they're good friends, but there's that undercurrent of a little bit of a nervousness, that simmering romanticism that is just under the surface. Here's Robert Redford, Meryl Streep from Out of Africa.
I heard you had made it. I'd have paid anything to see their faces. Hello.
Hello.
Would you join us for a drink?
I can't. How is it that you are home?
I brought Barkley back.
Has he been
No,
wounded?
fever. More than usual, but he'll be all right as long as the gin holds out.
And you? How is it with the fighting?
We're taking a beating. It's likely to last for a while.
I still have your compass.
Why don't you keep it? You've earned it. Besides, I don't always want to know where I'm going anyway.
Well,
Are you?
please don't let me keep you.
Are you all right?
Yes. Take good care, Dennis.
We're behind a story or two.
Yes, when I get back.
Back from where?
When you get back, I mean.
That's from Out of Africa, Meryl Streep and Robert Redford. There's a little uneasiness there. They're very formal with each other, but the sparks are very quietly beginning to fly in that movie. And I agree with you, Bob. It's good to revisit this film. It moves at its own pace, and it moves with the human element in the forefront, but it's a great Sydney Pollack picture from 1985. You are listening to Take Two, the movie program, and this is Public Radio, KCBX and KCBX HD1 San Luis Obispo, KSBX Santa Barbara. We're streaming worldwide at kcbx.org. Bob and I will continue our tribute to Sydney Pollack in just a moment.
You're listening to Take Two on Public Radio, KCBX San Luis Obispo, KSBX Santa Barbara. Streaming at kcbx.org. And you can write to us at movies@kcbx.org.
Funds are provided by Festival Mosaic 2008, a celebration of 5 centuries of music, presenting 4 evenings of intimate chamber music featuring international artists, July 11th through the 27th. More at festivalmosaic.com. We're back on Take Two, the movie program on Public Radio KCBX, broadcasting from San Luis Obispo, California. My name is Jim Dee. I'm here with my very good friend Bob Whiteford, and we're talking about the remarkable career of Sydney Pollack, not only as writer, actor, director, but as producer. And we're on his list of films, his directorial films, and it was right after Out of Africa, a film where he gets into the American-Cuba relations with Robert Redford called Havana. We don't have any clips from that. And actually, Bob, I saw this quite some time ago, and it's almost a blurry memory, but I want to revisit it, especially after I've gained quite an interest in Cuba, and I have to go back and take a look at this. But again, another collaboration with Robert Redford and Sydney Pollack. I think these guys definitely worked well together.
Absolutely, Jimmy. If I'm not mistaken, maybe this was the last film they did together.
I believe it is.
Unfortunately, I haven't seen it, so I can't comment on it.
I think also I did read that Pollack was rather upset that this was not a big box office, although, it's almost as if he hit a peak. Electric Horseman was quite good, Absence of Malice okay at the box office, Tootsie huge, Out of Africa huge, and then right after Out of Africa, perhaps American audiences not ready for a comment on American-Cuban relations, even though it had sort of a Casablanca feel about it. But That's when we're going to have to revisit ourselves here. So from 1990, Sydney Pollack directed Havana. But next, a big hit again for Sydney Pollack in 1993, and the first team up with Tom Cruise in John Grisham's The Firm. And Bob, I was just watching some of this today. I'd forgotten about the all-star cast in this film, and it's just, again, it moves at a deliberate pace, and it's slowly, the plot comes out very slowly but surely, but this is a remarkable film. Tom Cruise, for me, sometimes hit and miss, but under the direction of Sydney Pollack, I think he's quite remarkable in this film. But he's surrounded by Gene Hackman and Hal Holbrook. Ed Harris is in this film. It's a great film about a law firm that has some questionable situations going on that slowly but surely the Tom Cruise character finds out about. It's a fine film. I actually want to go back and watch it from beginning to end. I watched a lot of it, but it sucked me right in. I thought it was great. Again, intelligent characters, and there's something about a Sydney Pollack film where it's big, it's accessible, but he's always touching on things that you don't normally see in a commercial film.
Absolutely, Jimmy. And there's real star power at work here. I mean, when you've got Tom Cruise at the top of his game, you've got Ed Harris chewing up some scenery, you got Hal Holbrook, you got some good stuff going on. This is, dare I say it, a film that probably is better than the book, I would think. And definitely worth a look.
Before we hear a clip from The Firm, I did want to bring up, Bob, this situation that had come to my attention just today, because I gained access to a bunch of reviews of Sydney Pollack's films, and so I thought, okay, I'm going to read a bunch of these. And what kept on, the phrase that kept coming up, and sometimes it was complimentary and sometimes it wasn't complimentary, the term old school. And for me, applying the term old school to Sydney Pollack is a compliment of the highest order. Old school to me, in reference, when you think of Sydney Pollack, means a good script with characters, and perhaps the whole film isn't built around some, like you said, some special effect or some shootout or something like that. It's character-driven, characters that are intelligent, and a movie with a narrative drive and doesn't rush. It moves on the humanity of the characters. And I read I think it was a review of The Interpreter, which we will get to. It's pretty much his last dramatic film. And they kept on talking about old school. Here's a film released in 2005. It moves like 3 Days of the Condor. It moves like Absence of Malice. But of course, I guess in the rapid fire cutting of today's films, or the special effects, or just turning on events that are kind of silly as opposed to based in humanity, maybe The Interpreter didn't work for that reason. The fact that, oh my goodness, here's an intelligent movie. It's actually about terrorism, a very timely film. But I'm coming back to that term old school as applied to Sydney Pollack, and I say yes, but in a very complimentary way.
I concur, Jimmy. When I hear the term old school, to me that says there's a style, there's definitely a creative imprint on what you're going to see. You can expect certain things, which is good dialogue, good acting, and like you said, character-driven narrative. Pollack is not going to take you off on some pyrotechnic roller coaster ride in order to get you to come in and see his movies. He wants you to come in, but he wants you to come in on his terms, which are, we're going to follow the characters, and we're going to learn what it is we need to know through this. And being an old school kind of guy myself, and you're old school too, Jimmy. We're old school guys. One guy one time, a buddy of mine said I was even older school. I don't know if he was insulting me. He might have been, but I took it as a compliment. And I think I agree with you. I think with Sydney Pollack, old school for me works just fine, because That's us. You know, he's part of the old school, the great American filmmakers of the 60s and 70s. He was part of that high water time creatively in American cinema, and he's never compromised his values till the end. And I salute old school. And not the Will Ferrell movie, which I kind of like that anyway. The beer bong in particular was very good.
Well, we're talking about Sydney Pollack. We just got sidetracked on an old school discussion, but we were talking about Tom Cruise in The Firm, and a big hit for Sydney Pollack, a great film if you haven't seen it, with great star power. Here's a pretty self-explanatory clip. Here is the young lawyer, portrayed by Tom Cruise, who is slowly but surely, actually through his fellow lawyer, Gene Hackman, that there are things at the law firm that are a little bit questionable, and they've gotten kind of scary at the point. Right now, Tom Cruise is escorted by Ed Harris to talk to Stephen Hill, who you may remember as being Briggs in the first season of Mission Impossible. But later, I believe he was in a television show. You would recognize him if you saw him. But here's Tom Cruise and Stephen Hill in The Firm.
I appreciate your coming, Mr. McDear. I'll call you Mitch if I may. My name is Voiles, Denton Voiles. I'm with the Department of Justice.
What happened to Eddie Lomax?
We've been investigating Bendini, Lambert, and Locke for 4 years. No lawyer has ever left your law firm alive. 2 tried to leave, they were killed. 2 were about to try, you know what happened. Now, we have reason to believe that your house is bugged. Your phones are tapped. Your office is wired. They may follow you. They may be here in Washington as we speak.
Are you saying my life is
I'm
in
saying
danger?
that your life as you know it is over. Your law firm is the sole legal representative of the Moraldo crime family in Chicago, known as the Mafia, the mob.
I don't believe it.
They set up legitimate businesses with dirty money from drugs, gambling, prostitution. All cash, all moved offshore. You believe it. That's why you talk to Thomas A. Banks in the Caymans. That's why you got this private investigator asking questions that got him killed.
That's a clip from The Firm. Tom Cruise with Stephen Hill. In fact, it was the private investigator that got killed was Gary Busey in this Sydney Pollack film. And again, there's the theme again, Bob. It's people who seem to be in somewhat of a powerful position, but definitely overwhelmed by odds that seem to be insurmountable. In this case, you know, you leave the firm, you're going to end up dead. So there you go.
Well, I kind of like this because this is kind of a returning theme too. It's like there's the he goes with the you know, in the realm of the powerful, and you find that all that glitters isn't gold up in those penthouses. The price you pay to reside up there is far deeper than the money that it costs you. It's your soul, and this film touches on that. Interesting thought.
We're talking about The Firm. Sydney Pollack directed it in 1993. Now, I'm going to tell you the rest of the films in his directing career. Pollack followed The Firm with Sabrina, the remake. In fact, we'll have Pollack comment on that before the show is out. And then Random Hearts in 1999, The Interpreter with Sean Penn and Nicole Kidman in 2005. Also a documentary called Sketches of Frank Gehry about the architect in 2005. But you know, we were talking about Sydney Pollack as an actor, and, you know, I can't think of any film, I don't think one exists, where he plays the lead role. It's always in smaller supporting roles, but he's always very good, and he's always important, in my view. And for me, one of the most misunderstood films, a film that my wife and I loved when we saw it, but most people seem to not like, maybe it was ahead of its time, is Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut with Tom Cruise and Sidney Pollack, among others, Nicole Kidman as well. It's interesting how these stars kind of knew each other. Interestingly, too, in interviews with Sidney Pollack, he chose to work with Stanley Kubrick, also with Woody Allen and Husbands and Wives, just to see how other directors direct. And I just thought, coming from Sidney Pollack, a guy who has his chops, just let's put it that way, it's very interesting that he's so interested to see how other directors work.
I mean, that's fascinating. I've often heard a lot of stories or read a lot of stories about Sidney Pollack, the person, about what an interesting individual he was. I mean, he was urbane, a great host, but to have dinner, I think we touched upon this the last show. George Clooney said something like, dinner will never be the same, because he, could, not only when you dine with Sidney was it the finest food and wine, but the conversation was good. And apparently the guy was great at telling stories. And this is fascinating as well. I mean, I would love to hear what he thought working for Woody Allen, what he thinks working for Stanley Kubrick. Well, I think we're going to hear a little of that.
We are going to hear, and you talk about that great food. Nicole Kidman talked about what an incredible guy he was, and he was also a great cook. So maybe some of that great food that you had at dinner was cooked by the Chef Pollack himself.
It's a Renaissance man.
He is a Renaissance man. Well, we want to turn to Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut. Even though Sidney Pollack's character is a supporting role, it's a very important and integral part of the film, and the relationship between Tom Cruise and Sidney Pollack in this film is very, it's a very important point. And here's a scene from Eyes Wide Shut. It is Sidney Pollack and Tom Cruise. Pollack revealing to him that, he knew where Tom Cruise was the night before, which was a place where he should not have been. This is from Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut.
Bill, I know what happened last night. And I know what's been going on since then. And I think you just might have the wrong idea about one or two things.
I'm sorry, Victor. What in the hell are you talking about?
Please, Bill, no games. I was there. At the house. I saw everything that went on. Bill, what the hell did you think you were doing? I couldn't even begin to imagine how you'd even heard about it, let alone got yourself through the door.
That is Sidney Pollack and Tom Cruise from Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut. The reason they didn't know they were, Pollack knew that Tom Cruise was there. It was everyone at this, we'll call it a function, we're wearing masks, and therefore, and Tom Cruise gets exposed. That's how Sidney Pollack saw him at this place he should not have been. But a really remarkable scene, and we should just move right along to hear this commentary from Sidney Pollack. This is from the Stanley Kubrick documentary, My Life in Pictures is what I believe it's called. And both Tom Cruise, who narrates it, and Sidney Pollack are asked about what it was like to work with Stanley Kubrick on Eyes Wide Shut. And, they talk about the scene that you just heard. Here they are, Tom Cruise, Sidney Pollack, talking about the filming of Eyes Wide Shut.
He had that director's disease of really imagining the easy part of it until you get there, I'm sure he did not go into Eyes Wide Shut expecting to shoot for 14 months. But I must say, I thought the same thing. I said, well, I'll be out of here in 3 days. The first scene we did in 2 hours or something that night at the house where they come in and I just say hello. And so I said, well, what are all these things I hear about? It's going to take forever. I went there, and 3 hours later, I was back at the hotel in London. This is going to be a snap.
I remember even him teasing me, saying, "What are you doing, Cruz?" I said, "I know, it's great having you here, Sidney. You're perfect, you're just fantastic," because we shot it in a day.
And then,
of course, the next day, Sidney comes out, and he's dressed. He's got his sleeves up. He's in his pants. He knows every line of this massive, scene there. And he says, "Come on, let's run lines. Let's go, Tom. Let's go, Cruz. Let's go. I gotta go. I got a week, and again, we're gonna jam this out, and I'm gonna, it's gonna be fantastic." And we're doing the Steadicam shot of me coming into the room, And so Sidney goes, "Look, all right, how do you want me to do this?" And Stanley said, "Well, I don't know, let's try it and see." He says, "Well, I can go to the door fast." "Okay, well, let's see what that's like." He says, "Okay, now open the door." And then he says, "Well, maybe that's a little too fast." "Okay, I can go slower. I can go slower." So we start doing the scene this way.
By the third week, when we're in the billiard room, I'm saying, my God, how?
Of course, Stanley said, "Well, Sidney, I didn't think it would be much longer than that, but don't you want to get it right?"
I tell you, there are a lot of people in our business who are, well, they label themselves perfectionists. That's a kind of a euphemism for a pain in the ass, really. Stanley was the first real perfectionist that I met. There just wasn't any way for him to go one take less, or he never gave an inch.
That is Sidney Pollack and Tom Cruise talking about Stanley Kubrick and the filming of Eyes Wide Shut. I just love hearing Sidney, just astounded by Kubrick, his methods. And coming from a director of his stature, I find it even more amusing. It's great stuff.
Oh, absolutely wonderful. That's such a great scene between them in that kind of padded den. You could definitely tell that Pollack's character, a man of means and power, and it works so well. And it's amazing that it took 3 weeks just to shoot a scene opening the door. I thought Brando was out there. This is something else.
Well, Bob and I highly recommend Eyes Wide Shut and Sidney Pollack. Even though it's a small role, it's a great role. Now, the last film that Sidney Pollack, the last dramatic film he directed, called The Interpreter, I just caught up with this one, Bob, and it's really a great little film. Sean Penn is great as a Secret Service agent. Nicole Kidman is an interpreter who overhears the possibility of an assassination of a African diplomat. But there's more to the Nicole Kidman character. And what I think he does in this film is humanizes the so-called term terrorist or terrorism. He gives it a human face, and I really think this is a wonderful film that kind of came and went quickly despite the great performances by Sean Penn and Nicole Kidman. The Interpreter is a very fine film, and I highly recommend it. We got to get this clip in. As you recall, we opened the show with 3 Days of the Condor, Robert Redford making the note of, do you think not getting caught in a lie is the same as telling the truth? That statement appears in 3 of his films. Right now, here's Sean Penn and Nicole Kidman. Please don't mind the profanity. This is from The Interpreter.
Hey! I lost a man today. A kid. How do you know Kuhlman?
I don't. I never met him before.
You're lying to me again. You think that not getting caught in a lie is the same thing as telling the truth?
I'm not lying. I went to him for help.
With what?
I can't tell you. Someone might get hurt.
Someone might get hurt. There's a bus full of dead people. Someone might get hurt. Who? Someone you know?
No.
Someone who's mixed up in all this? Are you? Why did you leave Africa?
I told you.
No, you didn't tell me. Why did you come here?
Stop it.
God damn it!
Stop shouting at me!
Stop lying to me!
I'm not lying!
Stop lying to me!
I was just on that bus that blew up. I can't think with all this noise. I can't. You have to stop.
That's Nicole Kidman and Sean Penn from Sidney Pollack's The Interpreter, his film from 2005. Highly, highly recommended, especially if you've seen some of his earlier work. Now, we are running a little short of time, but we do want Sidney Pollack himself, again, to talk about himself. And he talks about his last film, which is a documentary film. He made himself on the architect Frank Gehry. This is from the DVD about interviewing how he got into the subject, but there's some elements in this interview that are so amazing. We want to share it with you. It's about 3 minutes, and then we will wrap it up. This is Sidney Pollack talking about taking on the project of Sketches of Frank Gehry.
Well, initially I didn't. Initially I felt completely unqualified, not being coy at all, but realistically unqualified as I was. Neither a documentarian nor a particularly literate person about architecture. I don't think I'd thought much about architecture at all. Something happened to me when I saw Bilbao, the museum in Bilbao.
When did you first see it? And
Well, I saw it in opening night in 1997. I'd had an invitation from Frank, who was an old friend. And I didn't believe that he was doing such a thing as sending invitations really to expect people to go to Spain for an opening night of something. I thought, man, if you had a movie and you said, hi, my movie's opening in Madrid, would you guys like to come over and see it? How many people would show up, you know? So I thought, well, this can't be serious. But I happened by accident, literally, to be in Madrid, doing publicity on a film that was flopping miserably, and it's terrible. It was the end of 12-country tour, and I had to face every country, knowing they hated the movie.
What was the film?
Never mind.
Okay.
We're not going to discuss that. You can figure it out time-wise. Okay. Anyway, that was a film I liked, actually, which shows you where my head is. And I was kind of depressed, and it was the end. It was the last stop, and I thought, I think this is the day Frank's museum is opening. And I went to Bilbao. I checked into a hotel, and I walked around a corner, and looking down a kind of hill with all of these buildings framing this sort of vision, I literally sort of stopped in my tracks. I don't think I'd ever had this happen to me with architecture before. And the closer and closer I got, I thought, I almost felt like I was in Close Encounters of the Third Kind or something. I just kept getting closer, and it was almost making a noise or something. It was a building that was so physically extraordinary that it made a sound in my head, and I didn't understand it. I really didn't, and it disturbed me a lot that I didn't understand it. I mean, I kept saying, and I went in and I met. I mean, I didn't have the invitation with me, and there had been a killing the day before. Somebody in the Basques had shot a guard. There was still an active Basque movement. I didn't have the invitation. And I thought, I'm never going to get past the security guys. And I went up and I was looking through the window kind of like this. And Frank was inside being interviewed on a television show. And he saw me through the window. And he came out and brought me inside and took me through it. And I kept on saying to him, where did this come from?
The remarkable words of Sidney Pollack. And the key there, Bob, to me is he looked at something, it kind of disturbed him, he didn't understand it, but what does he do? He explores it, he goes into it. I think that's the voice of a true artist, in the fact that you explore things that you don't understand, that maybe make you feel a little bit uneasy. And thank goodness for Sidney Pollack that he made a career of exploring through his motion pictures, through acting, writing, producing, and directing.
I think we're all better for it, Jimmy. He'll be missed.
Thanks for listening to Take Two. We'll see you next week.